want to continue on with what I've called social crises in British history. And remember, it's not a history of Great Britain or of England, or it's selected items because that's what we have time for. And there we go. I want a review of what we said in the first two classes. One of the big things to me, certainly, and in a way I just sort of articulated to myself, is that the centralized government has to do with who controls violence. Before Henry VIII, who tries to centralize things, not necessarily successfully, you have this feudal system of barons who have their people who come when they're called. And we'll see this continues on well until the beginning of the 18th century, but it's a long process. Now, well, we call the government. Government has police. That's what we mean by controlling violence. And when violence is not controlled, then you say the government is failing. In the 17th century, though, the 1640s in particular, there is this civil war, and I'm just reminding you of the terms of the Roundheads, who are the parliamentary people, and the Cavaliers, who are the king's people. And even though the war ends with the victory of Parliament, it's not preordained. Things could happen. But by the end of the war, Oliver Cromwell, who is a very good military organizer, is named Protector. And one of the things that he does is try to institute some of his Puritan beliefs in government. So there is the notion of not having too many parties, too many celebrations, and so on. And in fact, when you study 17th century literature, the Restoration literature of the 1660s on is sort of a joy that has burst forth. And something we'll talk about more today is England and Scotland. Remember, they are separate countries.
They are separate countries.
The successor to Elizabeth is James I of England and James VI of Scotland. And he has two different offices. They're not the same country. And an example of this is these what are called the Covenanters, the Scottish groups who signed a covenant to oppose English rule for various reasons. A lot of it has to do with their objections to the imposition of parts of the Anglican Church. But then the Covenanters in the late 1630s all of a sudden help out the Roundheads in opposing the king. And somehow they switched around. They also talked about these symbols of Tudor early Stuart society. The hat, meaning obeisance, taking off your hat, and the Quakers in particular got in trouble over that. But it's just a symbol of you have to obey your superiors. And the whip, that is to say, corporal punishment. Here, these are cartoons of, well, drawings. There's a schoolroom. Here is a Quaker meeting with a woman. Remember, women are given much more equality under the Quakers than they had been. And we talked about the Ulster plantation in Ireland, and we're going to say some more about that today. That is the Irish island. The island of Ireland is subject to colonization mainly from England and Scotland. If you look at that map, you see where it says lowlands, that's lowlands of Scotland. And in the 17th century, migration to Ulster, which is the Ulster plantation. The people are planted there in land that is confiscated from Irish landowners. So what is this Ulster plantation? For one thing, starting in the early 17th century, this migration is encouraged for political and economic reasons. Economic people who are wealthy people who get land like the fact that they're all of a sudden getting this big piece of property. And the English Protestants are called planters. And this is a map, it's may help you even for today, where you see these are the 6 Ulster counties that made up the plantation, and it's on that goes over to the west. So it's not exactly the same as what Northern Ireland is today. Northern Ireland today is Antrim, Down, Armagh, Monaghan, Tyrone, and Derry. This is current day Northern Ireland. Donegal is definitely the Irish Republic. And when we get, we'll spend a lot of time on 19th century Ireland later. But this is where what we now know as this Irish issues doesn't start there, but it gets heated up. There were people called, I'm amused, call them undertakers, a British term. It means an entrepreneur. These are undertakers who are wealthy landowners and companies in London. They get big areas of land that are expropriated, and then they bring in people, on ships. And even something like the Mercer's Company, which is today a philanthropic institution, they get 21,600 acres. They become quite wealthy way back when, even though they're doing good things for people in need. They are benefiting from grabbing this land from Irish owners. Initially, they didn't have that many migrants that had to rely on Irish tenants. So here's the beginning. British landlords, Irish tenants. English landlords. In the 1640s, there are enough of them there that there are some riots against Protestants, and a number of them are killed. And in the late 1640s, Oliver Cromwell leads an army over there with very severe reprisals, a number of massacres by the English against the so-called rebels. Then in the 1690s, there's a famine in Scotland. And now you really see an accelerated migration from Scotland to Ireland, or later on to the colonies, American colonies, Scots-Irish. You've heard that term. This goes from Scotland to Ireland, and later on with problems in Ireland, they go to the United States. And that's our Appalachia, if you will. But anyway, we'll see in a few minutes more about these issues of why there's famine. But first, I want to mention this restoration, which I mentioned just a minute ago about literature. The restoration in 1660, Charles II from the Stuart dynasty is brought back to become King of England and King of Scotland. It's still not one country. And Parliament is quiet at first, but they still are not, they haven't given up. Remember, there was the big defeat was in 1645 when Cromwell's army overwhelms the king's forces, and by 1649 you have the execution of Charles I. So Parliament is still there, has the power of the purse. That's what this started the dispute, and it continues today. Charles II is succeeded by James II in 1685, and James II is suspected of wanting to return Catholicism, and he wants to return to divine right. So it's not just any one thing, but he's only in power for 3 years, and we have what a number of you have probably heard of, this Glorious Revolution, 1688, where William of Orange, who's married to Mary Stuart of the Stuart family, comes in and is made King of England. As you see here, he's King of the Netherlands, England, Ireland, and Scotland. They're all separate. And he married into the Stuart family. Question is, was the Civil War really over? And whether the Civil War was only about Catholicism and Protestantism, it's not. That the religion has a lot to do with the Civil War, but the conflict is over parliamentary power to impose taxes and what the king wants to do. Scotland, we always think of Scotland as a country of John Knox Presbyterians, but there are a lot of Catholics up there too. So it's not as though Scotland is completely free of this. You're right about this thing. I just moved the microphone. Is that still all right? Yeah. So, I posed my own question, was the conflict solely over religion? It was not. Religion had something to do with it. And it sometimes became a rallying cry, but that wasn't the only conflict. So there are Catholics still in England who are upset about the imposition of the Anglican Church. There are Catholics in Scotland who are concerned about the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians in Scotland who are worried about the imposition of the English Church. So this continues for a while. But what we do see, especially after 1688, is the reduced power of the king and the triumph of Parliament. And I wrote there United Kingdom. It's a little early. United Kingdom becomes United Kingdom in 1707. That's when England and Scotland are brought together. And they didn't go peaceably. There are a lot of Scottish groups, the clans and the Catholics, become supporters of what are called the Jacobites, Jacobite meaning James. There's an uprising in 1715, which is put down, and another in 1745. That 1745 one is, why did that happen? I don't know. Whoops. Let's go back to 1745. Even
I think you put them there.
yeah, there's one we want.
I'm not seeing the slideshow.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to get rid of this other stuff. Why is that happening? Slideshow from the current slide.
It's not responding.
Not responding. Why is it? I'm going to stop screen sharing and reshare. Oh, look at that. We have 16 people there. Hello, everybody. Okay.
That's
back
great.
one
You
slide.
got the slideshow.
You can see it now, Martha?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not going to try to go backwards, but 1745 is the end of the man who gets on television still, Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was a profligate, a woman chaser, a poor director, but he was supported by the Highland clans in particular. And actually, I was corrected by a friend of mine who said that there were clans not just in the Highlands, but also in the Lowlands. But in 1745, they talk about the defeat of the Highland clans and with some very severe measures against them to try to defeat them. And it leads to long-standing anti-British feeling in Scotland. Another friend of mine told me he had a driver in London, about 20 years ago, who was Scottish. And my friend said he didn't know anything about the Highland clearances. And the driver went crazy. It's as though an American has never heard of the Civil War. I'll say some more about those clearances in a minute. They are associated with what's called the enclosure movement of agriculture. There used to be an open field system. We have large, well, I could go backwards. I'm going to go backwards. Boy, this is not. Okay. Enclosure meant turning common land into privately owned land. What happened before enclosures is that you have open fields, common fields, people have their own parts of them. And in enclosures, starting in the 15th century, initially to accommodate sheep farmers, but later on for other reasons, common land becomes privately owned. Now here's an example of what that before enclosure. You see you have here wheat and rye being grown here, oats and beans here, and fallow land in order to allow the land to recuperate for one season. And you have common areas, meadows. People can do all kinds of things in the meadows for themselves. But when you improve the agriculture, the commons doesn't support those people so much. And the English Civil War is seen as a major acceleration in the enclosures. That is, Parliament also is controlled by the landlords. And the landlords are interested in closing the fields to make perhaps a more efficient agriculture, but it's at a big social cost. The king is seen as someone who's in favor of the common farmer, common yeoman. So when I said before, these conflicts are not just over religion, they're not just over parliament and king, there are a lot of things going on. So what is going on is what some people call an agricultural revolution. And if it's not a revolution, English agriculture does become more productive. We're leaving aside the social costs, but better drainage, they rotate crops in a way that you don't have to have that fallow field. And most of all, hedging and fencing of private land. That's what we mean by enclosure. You are enclosing the land. So here is similar to what we just saw. In the fallow land, animals could graze, wheat and barley in the other two fields. But in addition, peasants could collect gleanings. That's what's left. You know, when you harvest your crop, there's stuff that falls on the ground, there are corners and that are not harvested. And peasants are allowed to go there and they're allowed to collect firewood. So this is just a picture of gleaners, people. If you know your Bible, Book of Ruth, it's all about gleaning, and Ruth meets Boaz because she's a gleaner. But with the enclosures, the upper classes want more land. You know, I mentioned before, feudal society is breaking down, and we gave this image of palaces replacing castles, but they want to support those palaces. They want to support their lifestyle. And here's an example of the 18th century. In the left image, the shaded areas, these shaded areas, Those are all common pastures of this town. On the right, by 1800, there are no common areas. Those are all fences in there, divided up into individual ownership. Now, of course, some peasants may benefit from that, but in the main, it's the big landowners who benefit from what's going on there. So peasants and yeomen is sort of, I guess, a British term for a relatively prosperous farmer. They ultimately disappear. You get tenant farmers, or later on migration to cities. And the peak of that movement started earlier, but it's in the 18th century, and that's really the end of the medieval peasant community. No more Robin Hoods, no more small farmers. It's just much more difficult for them. And here's an image. If you look at the side of the road, those are the boundaries that set off the field. See, they look like stone walls or hedges, which will prevent others from getting onto your fields. I like this picture because it's a very clear image of what an enclosure is. It doesn't have to be barbed wire or anything. You just have to build a fence that keep the others out. And the protest, this is from the 18th century. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose off the common, but lets the greater felon loose who steals the common from the goose. That is to say, the landlord who is stealing the common and doesn't allow the animals. Marxist historians and others, not just Marxists, see this enclosure as part of class conflict. Elimination of the English peasantry and emergence of the bourgeoisie. So you don't necessarily have to have a theory of the way classes are formed in society to agree that this is a kind of thing that's happening. People whom we're calling the peasantry disappear, and people whom we're calling the bourgeoisie appear. But in Marxist terms, that's what comes about. And for those of you who are interested in Marx talks about primitive accumulation. How did the first people, the landowners or the ruling people, get their start? He has various theories, but this is what they might call primitive accumulation. You break out the society, and a few people are grabbing the ownership of goods. So, and for some historians, this period of enclosure is that primitive accumulation. Well, in Scotland, you have something similar, and we have what are called the Highland clearances. Now, the clans, they're not families, they're bigger groups. You might call them tribes in another society. Ruled the Highlands of Scotland for hundreds of years. By the mid-19th century, they're seen as backward and old-fashioned. I wanted to show you this. The orange part, which we're calling the Highlands, and you see the names of the various clans. Now, as my friend pointed out, here in the blue, there are also clans in the lowlands, but they don't have the kind of power that the Highland clans had, and that power is broken after 1745, the big battle where the British defeat the forces of Bonnie Prince Charlie. James I, remember, he's the successor to Elizabeth. He comes in office in 1603. But he was also King of Scotland even before then. He feared the power of the clan chiefs. So this goes back. One of the things he tried to do is keep the clan chiefs away from their centers of power. You see them all here in in the Orange area. He's trying to, in the way that Louis XIV tried in France to get the nobles to come to Versailles rather than be in their centers of power. But James I was not quite as successful. Associated with that, agriculture follows the enclosure movement in England. Scotland has something similar. And this is a picture that's shown a lot of the Highland clearances, people being kicked off the land. It's really it's not a photo, it's a idealized image, but this is what we think happened. Originally, in the 17th and 19th century, it takes a long time, settlements of families were jointly farming. Not exactly the same as the commons in England, but similar. They had grazing on common land, and that's what the enclosures defeated. But in the 18th century, they get this a new kind of plow. They got crop rotation. They introduced the potato, and you've heard of the potato famine in Ireland, and that's in the 19th century, but this is the potato comes in. There's this famous story about introducing the potato on the continent in Austria-Hungary. The peasants really didn't want to adopt anything new. So the story is what the monarchy did was have royal fields planted with potatoes and allow people to steal them until they got hooked on having their own potatoes. So anyway, the enclosures, that was just a story of Austria-Hungary, but people don't change readily. It takes a while. What's interesting is that Scotland became a leader in agriculture for all of Europe, but it paid a very high social cost for that. Starting in the second half of the 18th century, they're ending these shared farms. That's where Highland clearances start. And by the 19th century, tenants are forcibly removed, kicked off with support of the army. Remember, who controls violence? It's not as though they have to have their own guys come. They kick them off and they're supported by army or no regular police, but army. And in the 18th century, about half the population lived in the Highlands. And just as an interesting figure, 1981, there's still people up there, 21%, but it's much less than in previous periods. Actually, I was kind of surprised that it's that high, but they're living in towns too up there. And I mentioned a few minutes ago this driver of a friend of mine who was upset, my friend had not heard of the Highland clearances. Well, in 2019, there's an exhibition at the National Gallery. I'm going to try to move this, where people are upset saying, you're not talking about the Highland clearances enough. Any public, here's the protest, any public attempt to depict the history of the nation without portraying the end of the old peasant society by widespread dispossession must be considered seriously flawed and unbalanced. And this is just an image of police, or probably army, kicking people off the land. So it's still in the consciousness of people. And we think that, again, I have to move these things, probably 150,000 Highlanders are cleared. Lots of them go to Ireland, later to the colonies. And what's also, as someone pointed out to me, that some of them are more successful in their agriculture, and they go all over Europe. You get Scots in Russia and in the Mediterranean areas who become successful businessmen. But that's only a few. As I said, there's a big famine in the 1690s, and it really accelerates that move to Ireland. And it may be due to climate change. I'll show, we'll get to that in a second. I just want to add to the highland clearances, there are lowland clearances. So thousands of tenant farmers from the lowlands start migrating to cities, industrial centers, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Northern England. So that's the Scottish agricultural revolution, just like the English. And just to show you, we always think of Scotland as I always think of Scotland as a country being eaten by sheep. Well, the it's whatever color that is, yellowish. That's sheep country. Oh, the large part of the country, also out. Whoops, here when I hate the islands. These are the Hebrides, the Orkneys, the Shetland Islands. They all sheep in that cold weather. That's what you get. And then you have up here in the north, crops and beef along the coast, potatoes and fruit, crops and vegetables, dairy and beef. That's today, the results of all these changes. But agriculture is also a function of the climate and the quality of the soil. So what's happening is that landowners are running their estates for revenue and profit. Under the clans, their sources of military power and authority. Now it's, well, you want to call it capitalism or whatever you want to call it. It's different. I'm just going back for a second to what is happening politically at the same time as these agricultural changes are taking place. After the revolution of 1688, there is a lot of loyalty to the Stuarts, especially in Catholic areas. And the 1707 Act of Union isn't something that they bring up to the Scottish Parliament and everyone says, yeah, we want to do it. It was a big struggle, both before and after 1707. And then you have the Jacobite risings, which end with the Battle of Culloden. This is really part of Scottish mythology. The Battle of Culloden, 1746, and I'm calling it the swan song of Highland clan culture. So this is the image of the redcoats against the kilts in the Battle of Culloden. The Battle of Culloden was fought on this moor, 16th April 1746. The graves of the gallant Highlanders who fought for Scotland and Prince Charles are marked by the names of their clans. So it's an historical marker, but two kinds of markers. One is sort of hearkening back to the old days, but once this happened, that's really the end of clan power because the British brought in their troops to enforce royal power. They would try to do things like outlaw the tartan of individual clans, outlaw the bagpipes, outlaw the teaching of Gaelic. These are when we say suppressing the clans, these are the kinds of things they're trying to do. And it was, I think you could call it military rule in many cases. In addition, you have some landowners in cooperation with the army and government. They're evicting farmers to allow sheep herding. And they're clearing out the population. And we just saw that. And that's an image we saw a few minutes ago, the same one. Terrible plight of these people being kicked out. Well, the peak of that enclosure movement, which started earlier in this, maybe even as early as the 17th century, but from 1760 on, it really accelerates. And by the mid-19th century, there's no medieval peasant community. I think this is just to reinforce some of those images. And these pictures here are, again, romanticized is a funny way, made up, idealized image of what's happening. But the top one is the families on the road. They don't know where to go. A lot of them end up in Ireland. Bottom left, families being split up. And here, in the bottom right, you have the landowner taking over with his tough guys to enforce what's happening. And here's what the landlord said. The peasant is a wicked, cross-grained, petty farmer who's like the sow in his year, almost an insulated individual who has no communication with the opinion of the world. And they look at the village poor as designing rogues who, under various pretenses, attempt to cheat the parish. That is, landless people who have the nerve to demand some charity, something to eat, something for their families. It's a different, I just wanted to throw this image out. It's not as though that everybody agrees that the king is bad and they're good. There are divisions in the society. And here we have an image of the landlord disregarding the begging of his tenant here. Climate change. There's something called the Little Ice Age. And if we look at this graph of changing temperatures, remember that 1 or 2 degrees makes a big difference. We read about that all the time now. And between 1000 and 1200, the medieval, quote, warm period, and after 1200, the temperature starts dropping, and it drops appreciably between 1400 and 1800. And by the way, look where it is in 2000. Yeah, what's going on? I mean, this is the tragedy of our time, but this is climate. When you have deniers of climate change, I say, oh, the climate has always changed. It's true, but the 20th and 21st century are different. But anyway, this has an effect. If you have a little ice age, in Great Britain, you have poor crops. You have livestock is having more trouble surviving. And there is more disease, increased pathogen activity, more disease, and it's aggravated by unemployment, meaning people are not eating well. And then, as an aside, you find a demon. Who caused this? Well, witches. That's an attack on witches, who are usually women. By the way, it's the same stuff as in New England, but it happens in England, it happens in France. And then, because of this conflict, you have added animosity between Protestants and Catholics, and between Presbyterians and other Protestants. So society, it's not a nice time. It's difficult. And what happens in England, some groups say, well, if we reform Parliament, we can fix all this, which is not true, but this is what happens. And there's the famous example of the borough of Old Sarum, which elects 1 member of Parliament by 7 people. There's another one, I've forgotten the name of it, which is underwater, which also elects somebody. So it's hard to read what they're saying, but the man on the right is paying. He says, here's the cash for the votes. I'll leave them to you. I have pretty good eyesight to see that stuff. He says, here they are, all good votes, ready to vote for my coach horse and as I ordered them. Give me the money and I'll secure you the seat. Other things are going on. I mean, so I'm just, we're not going into detail on any of these things, but it's happening. The first half of the 18th century, there's a huge increase of alcoholism due to gin. And by the 1740s, in England, people were drinking 2.2 gallons of gin per person per year. I'm not sure what that means on a daily basis, but William Hogarth, who's a famous lithographer, has this thing called Gin Lane, where just people are drunk everywhere, drowning their sorrows in gin. Gin started to decline for whatever reason after 1750. Population is growing, the rise in food prices and lower wages, how that ties in with the decline of the gin craze, I can't answer. But for the upper classes or the middle classes, coffee appears. It's introduced into Europe by Ottoman janissaries. Remember, janissaries are this military corps of the Sultan. And as someone says, Vienna would resist the Turkish siege, 1683, but it was defenseless against the coffee bean. So by the 1670s, you have all these coffee houses. They're intellectual and political centers. They become important. So here's an image of a coffee house, as they say, a roaring fire with warmth and hot water, a penny on the counter, a dish of coffee or chocolate, newspapers hanging on the walls, entertainment and conversation. This is obviously not for the people affected by the gin craze. It's not for the people affected by the Highland clearances, but there are other groups in society who do benefit from this. In addition to coffee, tea arrives from China. And by the 1730s, £1 million are imported annually from China by the East India Company. The East India Company, which later gets involved in colonization of India, right here starts off as a trading company. And we think that tea replaces beer and ale as the British national drink in this period. You don't drink water, probably for good reason. Water is not pure. Well, once you heat it or put alcohol in it as a beer, it's a lot healthier, or not as bad for you. But with coffee and tea, they introduce sugar. And why is that important? Well, first of all, sugar leads to something called break fasts. Bread, butter, milk, water, and sugar, and then you add tea, coffee, or chocolate. And what this replaces is home-brewed, well, it's called small beer, weak beer, bread, cheese, or smoked fish. And according to some people, this is the triumph of the British sweet tooth. Puddings, creams, cheesecake, jams, jellies. These are big things in the British diet. Of course, they're in our diet too, but this is where it gets started with all this sugar. Well, where does the sugar come from? It starts off by coming from Southeast Asia, the monsoon regions, from New Guinea to the Bay of Bengal, Bay of Bengal between India and Bangladesh now. And it's a luxury until they find a way to increase production. And they find that in Brazil and in Barbados. Now, where's Barbados? I had to remind myself too, it's not as though I'm a genius on this, but if you think of right here where the mouse is, that's a tip of Florida. And then you have this series of sugar islands, if you will, going all the way down to Barbados, which is not far from the coast of South America. And what happens is that this is the birthplace of British slave society. This is a horrible image. British shippers were envious of the Dutch and Portuguese merchants who were in the Far East, and they, quote, discovered Barbados. And in Barbados, you have this sugar cane. It takes 14 months to ripen. It has to be stripped, cut, crushed in rollers, And you need workers with strength, speed, and stamina in the tropics or tropical conditions. And what they do is introduce African slaves to do this. By the 1670s, there were 60,000 African slaves in Brazil, and then this is imitated in Barbados. Once they strip the sugarcane, the sugar becomes relatively easy to transport in bulk. Why did that do that? I'm not sure why this, I don't know. There we go. An image of slaves and overseers. In the background, you see someone getting a whipping. And here is someone stripping the sugarcane. Here's turning that sugarcane into sugar. This is just a composite of all the different activities. Some of the richest families in Great Britain today are descendants of the Barbados plantation owners. I saw some of their names. Some of them are still in Parliament or House of Lords. Yeah.
Barbados was important because it was the closest to Africa.
Barbados, yes. But I don't know if you all heard that. Libby was saying that Barbados is in part chosen because it's the shortest route from Africa. It's closest, just as Brazil is close. So later, but from Barbados, we'll see it goes to North America. But so they're sugar islands, not just Barbados, Jamaica, Barbados, Nevis, Antigua. And you get this Atlantic slave trade. That is, the slaves are brought to the Americas. Here are all those sugar islands over here. They're brought to the Americas and then to southern colonies, and then sugar, tobacco, and cotton goes to Europe. And Europe, in turn, exports textiles and manufactured goods here, which are sold for slaves. This is this Atlantic slave trade. It's this infamous trade in the 18th century mainly and into the 19th century. On the other hand, in Great Britain now, to its credit, the anti-slavery movement starts with the Quakers as early as the 17th century. So not only they're not doffing their hats, they're saying this is a bad thing to have slavery. And in 1807, buying and selling of slaves becomes illegal in Great Britain. You probably,
Could you say what happened?
pardon, how did it happen? Yeah, it's Parliament who passes that, and it's a constant working on members of Parliament to get this done. The Quakers are very successful businessmen. If you recall, 1808 is when the United States forbids the importation of slaves. We didn't necessarily enforce it, but that's one of the compromises from the U.S. Constitution from 1787 that said you can't outlaw importation of slaves till 1808, and they immediately did it. But of course, slavery continued. Here's from Charleston, South Carolina. It's a advertisement, as you see, to be sold, a cargo of 94 prime healthy Negroes, consisting of 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls, just arrived in the brigantine Dembia, this is the name of the ship, from Sierra Leone. In 1843, Britain abolished slavery. As you know, we in the United States theoretically abolished it in 1865, but it took a long time to really abolish it. There are some former colonies that were from the British, and they're all Muslim, where slavery existed most of the 20th century. In Bahrain, Kuwait, Let's move this. Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, slavery may even still exist in some parts of those countries. And they were all controlled by foreigners, mainly British. Well, what else is happening? I mean, there's a very quick survey of things. We have the gin craze, we have enclosures, we have slavery. Well, here comes Methodism in the 18th century. And some people have claimed that Methodism, which has these rallies in the countryside, what's called the First Great Awakening, served to quiet radical unrest. It started as a revival movement within Anglicanism. So John Wesley, whose name you probably have heard of, is an Anglican minister. And then the really successful proselytizer is a man named Jabez Bunting. And I took out a lot of this stuff on Jabez because just enough time. But here is an example of these meetings, gospel meetings, where the great preacher is there. And it's from the middle of the 18th century. And some historians have said that instead of protesting against the government, people turned to God and the church in this sense. And the Methodists are not, they break away from Anglicanism. The Anglicans, the high church is not real happy with them. So just to review some of the things that we've said today, there's a lot of material here, a lot of things were going on that create the society that we know today. There were social crusades in English society, the plight of children. There's this anti-slavery stuff in this medallion you see, am I not a man and a brother? And common to all crusades, there's religious fervor. So from the 1770s on, that's when you get these dissenting faiths, not just the Methodists, but others as well. And it's reminiscent of Oliver Cromwell's time. Remember we talked about the Diggers, the Levelers, all these other egalitarian movements. We have Methodism, which we just mentioned. We have Unitarianism, which emerges. It says Jesus is not the Son of God, but he's the first of the reformers. So there is this social message in Unitarianism. And the reformers in the 18th century, unlike the 17th century, are men of science and industry. So we get Joseph Priestley, discoverer of oxygen, Josiah Wedgwood, he's the one who made that medallion. It's a ceramic factory. These are just examples of well-to-do or well-known people in society and who are reformers. And for the very last slide, we haven't talked about the Industrial Revolution, and we're not going to talk a lot about it in this course, mainly because I don't have time. But early industrialization is often associated with factories. Now, the point is, what is a factory? I remember being surprised and impressed by a teacher I had who said the essence of a factory is not water power, electric power, or any of that stuff. It's discipline. It's the control of the workers in the buildings. And in the what's called the putting out system, where people work in their own little shacks, there isn't the same kind of control. There's economic pressure. But the factory is where you have people concentrated and overseers watching them. Now, this is an infamous picture of how kids were used in the textile mills, both in Britain and America. they're in there when the threads break, they're in there trying to fix them or to reload the rollers. So how do you, at the same time, with the poverty which is associated with these enclosures and with the factories, you have poor laws. How are you going to help people? And under Queen Elizabeth, you have the first poor laws, haphazard. They're enforced on the parish level. Those of you who are fans of Charles Dickens have read all about the kinds of things that could happen under the enforcing of the poor laws, people being forced into workhouses, forced into work, broken families. But those poor laws, they're revised in the 19th century, and and Dickens talked about those, but they last until the 1940s. It's 1940s is what we see as the emergence of the modern welfare state. And if you read about the National Health Service, you see that the welfare state in Britain's in trouble. But here is the new poor law with a description of the new workhouses. Going back 1590s, there are poor harvests. You get migrations to cities and abroad, first to Ireland, later to America. You get population growth. I don't think I should explain the demographic transition, just to say there's population growth, and we may talk about that in another class. Probably after the Civil War, but at the same time with the growth, you get child labor, you get urbanization and slums. So this one slide here is just talking about terrible degeneration of parts of society that are intermingled with the agricultural revolution, with the triumph of Parliament, and we'll see next week, we talk about the 19th century, how Parliament itself needs to be updated, and so you don't have old Sarum with 7 voters giving you a person being elected. So with that rapid summary of some social ills, I'm going to stop. And if someone wants to have has any questions, I did have just want to say that I had a friend who said I wasn't doing justice to the Scots, that there were clans, first there were clans in the lowlands, and then he wanted me to go back to the Picts, who precede the Gaelic people. That's gone a little far. But anyway, Scotland has its own complicated history, just as Ireland does, but do what we can. Anybody want to say something? Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned the Puritans and the Puritans, the Anglicans.
Wait.
You previously mentioned. I don't know.
The question is, who are the Puritans essentially, and how do they relate to the Anglican Church? The Puritans initially are Anglicans, and they want to purify the English church. And they want to get rid of what they consider papish admixtures, whether it's icons or images, all kinds of stuff, or various holidays. So a lot of those Puritans come to America, and they dominate the Anglican Church. So they are synonymous for a long time. But it's for control of the Anglican Church. Eventually, the Puritans split off, but it takes a while. Neville, did you want to say something?
I'm just trying to get the mic.
I was going to ask you about the tragedy of the commons. It seems to me that before enclosures were abandoned, the system was breaking down.
What Neville is saying, he thinks that even before enclosure, the system was breaking down because
the greediest people would take over the most land in the commons.
because the idea was what Neville is saying and pointing out, that just because they're called commons doesn't mean they're equitably divided, but that local people could control what's going on. Sure, there is some of that.
Tragedy of the commons.
tragedy of the commons, but still you don't have this massive expulsion of people from their homes. So, and again, this stuff doesn't happen overnight. You know, century and a half. Centralization of government takes 150 years. And enclosure in the agricultural revolution takes a long time. But by the 19th century, we have a whole new world of stuff that is going on. Anybody else?
Could I just throw in something that I read in a book some years ago called Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher? And he talked about the clearances and the border wars between the English and the Scots. And this meant guns. And they were kicked out, or they, you know, for all these reasons that Larry's gone into, they leave that area, come to America. A lot of them land in Philadelphia, and the Philadelphians say, no, take your guns elsewhere. They go to the Appalachians and Appalachia, and have their guns there, and then gradually move west and become cowboys and form the NRA. It's the gun culture in this country, and that's where it comes from. Well,
We're going to stop the questions here. If someone else would like to ask questions, I'll stay around, but thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to log off.